Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A very warm welcome to Te Wharewanaka Ōrākei Lincoln University. Welcome to the first Lincoln University State of the Nation's Environment Address since 2019. Thank you for being part of a very large audience here today, both in person and online. This event is part of this Lincoln University State of the Land initiative that brings together research, insight, and global collaboration to answer the most pressing issues facing our land-based sectors. Through this suite of thought leadership events, we are telling the story of our whenua, its health, its challenges, and the future. The State of the Land Environment Address has been a key contributor to the national discussion on environmental issues since its inception in 1999. It was the brainchild of Emeritus Professor Ian Spellerberg. This event has shone a light on some of the most critical environmental concerns of the day, as presented by some illustrious names: Dame Marilyn Waring, the Right Honourable Helen Clark, Honourable Dr. Nick Smith, Ta Mark Solomon, and Sir Peter Gluckman most recently. This prestigious event has been absent from our annual calendar since the advent of COVID in 2019. But today, we're absolutely delighted to bring back this event after a 5-year hiatus. I'm sure today's presentation will herald a new era in the influential and inspirational event and lead to an environmental conversation in Aotearoa, New Zealand. At this point, I'm really pleased to pass and introduce to Dr. Roy Montgomery, Associate Dean of the Faculty of Environment, Society and Design, to tell us a little bit more about the event's founder, Ian Spellerberg. Thank you, Ian.
Tēnā koutou, katoa. Ko Roy Montgomery, ko tēnei taku mihi ki tā takata whenua o te Rotary Nei, ko Kapi Moki. Ka mihi poki au ki tā toku o te Nei. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, katoa. So I was giving acknowledgement to the Tangata Whenua, particularly Kapi Moki at Tamutu, acknowledge them, the people of the land, and think that the reason I'm up here is to introduce the founder, in a sense, even if he doesn't quite make it to himself. So Professor Emeritus Ian Spellerberg, I prepared this little presentation on the assumption that he wouldn't be here, so I'm kind of hoping he's decided to stay away because I can have a little bit more fun at his expense, and he won't get me asked his looks. But he'd be so pleased. He was at the earlier event, so he's seen some of you already, but he'll be so pleased to see such a big turnout, because that was one of his very cherished principles, to be a catalyst for discussion and debate beyond the academy. So not just a scholar, but a public servant in the sense of catalysing and debate. So with that in mind, I don't know quite how many minutes this, but I'll try to speak to these slides that are here. Get going again? Okay? Yep. So, I said I'd be slightly facetious. This is a series of photos of Professor Ian Spellerberg in what I call his natural habitat, and showing his natural markings, which you'll see involves almost always a three-piece suit, which he practiced whether it was in public or at the university, and for those of us who worked with him in the Department of Environmental Management, it always forced us to lift our game in terms of our dress, or feel very ashamed of what we turned up into work, because he always set that standard. So you'll see that he's a rather shy specimen. He likes to hide behind books or behind foliage in his most comfortable space. You can see him there on the left about to devour an entire volume of encyclopedia. He had a voracious literary appetite, and that exists to this day. In the corner here, this is Ian introducing one of the State of the Nation's Environment addresses a few years ago. So this is the man that kicked off this whole process. Natural habits. On the left-hand column of the ledger, that's the academics. So this is Ian's record as an academic, his roles at the university. Move over this way a bit more. Forward a bit more. I'll be doing mine now. So these are his achievements in academic terms, and that involves being Professor of Nature Conservation here, being the Director for the Centre of Resource Management. We've had our 50-year anniversary this afternoon, so Ian's been very much a part of that in the last 25 years and has co-established a number of initiatives here, and was a real star in terms of publications and research outputs. So very, very strong academic record. But I really want to focus on the right-hand column of this presentation. He has always been passionate about the environment. And you can see what he did. While he was busy writing peer-reviewed articles, he was also writing letters to the editors, doing op-eds, encouraging public discourse in lots of different ways. And he never stopped doing that. And even in times when it was quite hard to get an op-ed into the press, for the rest of us, Ian could somehow manage it. Because he had a very diplomatic style as well. He could be passionate about things, but he was never unreasonable. And he also thought of the town and gown relationship. I don't know if that's a familiar thing to you nowadays, but the idea that if you are a university, even in an urban setting, you should be a good neighbour. And he was involved in a lot of things like Lincoln Environment Town with Sir Jarvis and others that exist to this day. This idea that you practice, you walk the talk, and then you try and do things locally as well. So you can see there are a number of initiatives there that he helped found or was involved in. And of course, any of you who know him know his passion, on the one hand, his passion for native plants, native species, and on the other hand, his impatience with certain exotic species, and introduced species, and in particular, the silver birch. I teased him this afternoon about that, and he's been to leave, so I'm not going to do it again. But Ian was adamant that where we could, and should be doing ecological restoration, it should be as much using native plants and species as possible. I was tempted to put the lorax of Lincoln University, but I thought that was a little too facetious. But in essence, he was and is the conscience of environmental values in this country. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. You can see what he initiated the State of the Nation's Environment addresses. He was passionate about inviting people into the university to stir up. Sometimes he was quite provocative sometimes, who he chose to bring in. And yeah, I think I'm going to leave it with one last slide, or two. This is Ian dedicating a poem to the late Dr. John Hayward, who was a predecessor in terms of director of the Centre for Resource Management. There's two tote right there, one living and one past. And that's Ian getting a dedication to the tote that was put in place just over there. in the mid-90s. But this is the one I like the most. This is Ian Banker's Natural Habitat. These are all his publications. He's not really showing off. I mean, he probably had to be bullied into something like that. But this is a man who really lives and breathes all of our environmental values that we try and teach and practice here at Lincoln University. Ian, in your absence, I want to thank you again for doing the extra mighty and the extra yards to set these kinds of things up. And it's good that we've revived it and that we're carrying it on. So I'm really looking forward to the first address in 5 years from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment.
Apologies, but we're just going to take a 5-minute break and just fix the audio before we invite Simon up to deliver his presentation. Beautiful. Kia koutou, and welcome back. I trust that sounds a little better than it did previously, so thank you. Firstly, thank you, Roy, for those words about Emeritus Professor Ian Spellerberg. He was hugely influential in the establishment of this, and it was good to see him here earlier today at the 50-year celebration around this. And we're very proud to bring it back, and very proud of the role that Lincoln University plays in leading discussion about the environmental challenges facing our world. We are Lincoln University as a specialist land-based university. We value our education and research, aiming to deliver impact at the intersection of particularly between agriculture and environment. Through our education and research, we focus on addressing some of those key grand challenges, which are big in the global sense. How do we feed a global population that will soon reach 8 to 9 billion people? How do we mitigate some of the environmental issues and harms associated with the agri-food production system? With globally 31% of the total greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture. Agriculture using 70% of the water worldwide, and 90% of deforestation associated with agriculture, and contributing significantly to biodiversity loss. The work we do here at Lincoln, at the heart of the intersection of land-based industries and the environment, and is very much important. And I look forward to hear the contribution from Simon Upton and his thoughts here tonight. Today's speaker, Simon Upton, needs little introduction. He was a Member of Parliament from 1981 to 2000, holding a variety of ministerial portfolios, including environment, research, biosecurity, health, and state services. He is Fellows of the Royal Society of New Zealand and a Chairman of the Roundtable for Sustainable Development at the OECD. He returned to the OECD as Environmental Director in 2010 and led the OECD's contribution to 2015 Paris Climate Accord. Simon is a Rhodes Scholar, like myself, with degrees in English literature, music and law from the University of Auckland, and an MLit in political philosophy from Oxford University. He is now halfway through his second 5-year term as the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, and he joins us today to explore what we don't know about the state of New Zealand's environments and ask the question, does it matter? Please welcome Simon Upton. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak today. The last event of this size I attended was Mr. Bolger's funeral, and I got influenza A, and I'm still coughing. I'm sorry. Is that sound right to you? Okay, right, good. You're going to get amplified coughs. I'm sorry. I'm not going to take the risk of nominating particular trailblazers for environmental science who have issued from these precincts, but I can't resist noting two intersections between my own life and people who are or have been important to Lincoln University. In the first place, I want to acknowledge, he's already drawn the connection, the current Vice-Chancellor as a fellow Rhodes Scholar. As as Grant said, I went to Oxford to read political philosophy. He went to study behavioural ecology. And I'm sure you've got no doubt about which was the more worthwhile endeavour. Secondly, can I pay tribute to my predecessor, Helen Hughes, who was the very first Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment appointed in 1987. Helen was one of the first two people to be awarded honorary doctorates by the newly independent Lincoln University in 1993. Helen died almost a year ago to this day, and she made a profound contribution to New Zealand, and Lincoln's recognition of her was richly deserved. I've come to talk to you today about what we know and what we don't know. That says what we don't know, but what we know and what we don't know about the state of New Zealand's environment. Back in 1997, as Minister for the Environment, I was responsible for producing New Zealand's first ever State of the Environment report. It was a 655-page doorstopper stuffed with really fascinating material. Among other things, the report assembled a table summarising the state of our environmental data. Many of the identified gaps remain unfilled to this day. 10 years on, one of my successors, Trevor Mallard, released the second State of the Environment report. And that was almost as voluminous at 460 pages. Then, Nick Smith designed, and Amy Adams passed in 2015, the Environmental Reporting Act, with the purpose of requiring regular reports on New Zealand's environment. The Act set up what I think of as a hamster wheel production line, requiring domain reports every 6 months, with a synthesis report every 3 years. 10 years on, in November 2025, we've completed 3 cycles of 5 domain reports and a synthesis report, and we're now into the 4th cycle. It's a never-ending treadmill. Now, with the frequency of reporting on the state of New Zealand's environment, while that's increased, many gaps still bedevil our understanding, and that's not surprising. The minister who passed the act that set the hamster wheel in motion assured her cabinet colleagues, I checked out the cabinet papers, that the aim of the exercise wasn't to devote any more resources to gathering information. God forbid, no fiscal risk. It's just about publishing what we already have. So almost 30 years after the first State of the Environment report, our picture of the state of our environment is riddled with gaps. So, I ask again, what do we know and what do we not know about the state of New Zealand's environment? Well, let me give you the picture version. We know that New Zealand's environment is diverse and complex, characterised by a varied climate, unique biodiversity, distinct land and marine features. The climate ranges from subtropical to temperate. It's influenced by mountains that create dry and wet regions, resulting in moderate temperatures and high rainfall. The country is a hotspot for endemic species on land and in the sea, though many are threatened with extinction. And there are ongoing environmental pressures like pollution, habitat loss, climate change. When you dig deeper, there are many things we do not know. Significant data and knowledge gaps bedevil our understanding. Take biodiversity, for example. Our understanding of the state and trend of our native biodiversity remains patchy. Many species haven't even been named. Now, have a look at this slide. We know more than that, by the way. I'm going to build it. Have a look at this slide, which shows an approximation of the likely number of major groups of flora and fauna in New Zealand. This proved to be phenomenally difficult to construct, maybe because I asked an ecologist on my team to do it, and they can never make their mind up about the edge of things. But he trawled in the literature, and this took, I'm not exaggerating, this took about a week for him to do. And he's very worried about me using it. But let's be bold. As you can see, we have described around 21,600 invertebrate species, but there may be more than twice that number. For fungi, We've described 8,000 or so here, but there may be as many as 32,000, I'm told, and it's hard to know which are native or not. For vertebrates and other related species, we've identified about 1,700, but there might be as many as 2,600. Maybe that's because we don't really know so much about what's out to sea. We have described 700 bacteria, but again, it's hard to say whether they're actually native, and the true number is simply unknown. Protozoa paint a similar picture. We've described about half of what there may be, so 500 out of maybe 1,100. When it comes to plants, there may be as many as 8,600. Roughly half of these are algae and mosses. For vascular plants, suddenly it gets precise. Doc says there are 2,844. But it's a number that continues to grow as new discoveries are made. So what we don't know about out there continues to invade the diagram. Now look, successive attempts to gather better information on our biodiversity, especially on private land, have foundered. For example, in the early 1980s, something called the Protected Natural Areas Program was established to survey all 268 ecological districts in New Zealand. The idea was to identify and protect a representative sample of all natural ecosystems. These surveys identified recommended areas for protection, RAPs. After 2 decades, the program was quietly shelved, having got through just 95 of the 268 districts. A successor initiative was the identification of significant natural areas by local councils under the RMA. From the outset, it was opposed by some landowners who regarded it as an infringement of their property rights. Iwi have been similarly aggrieved, seeing the initiative as one that cuts across both rangatiratanga and tikanga. So after a further 2 decades, that effort is also grinding to a halt. The government's just suspended any further surveys for 3 years. So you add all that together, there's 40 years of not getting there. One of my interests has been trying to understand the risks posed by weeds, particularly those that pose a risk to native ecosystems. In my 2021 report, Space Invaders, I described an information base that is at best patchy. By the way, that's Chilean flame creeper. Apparently, Doc's given that one away now. Rakiura, Stewart Island, it's no longer controllable. It's just one of many. And it looks rather pretty, but when it doesn't have leaves, it's like a cage. Just a cage of twine stems. It's extraordinary stuff, but we chose it for the photogenic purposes. It is unclear how many exotic plant species there are in New Zealand. There is no up-to-date and authoritative list of plant species growing in New Zealand. This poses a challenge. If we don't know what's here, how can we say what may be new to New Zealand? We obviously need to know what's here if we're going to be able to respond appropriately to new arrivals, but sometimes we want to know what's here so that we don't end up trying to prevent the importation of plants that are already here. I just ran across this the other day at Pukeiti. I'm a member of the Rhododendron Trust, and they asked me to speak to them, and so I did a bit of digging, and they face this extraordinary problem. There are hundreds of rhododendrons here that are not on the PBI, or whatever it's called, MPI's list. So they're having to prove that a whole series of things were here before a particular date in, was it 1990-something? They've so far done 101 of them. But they can't, you see, they are part of an international rhododendron protection network. It's ex situ conservation, and they've linked Pukeiti, which of course is at risk of a volcanic eruption, with other collections around New Zealand, so that all of these rare rhodos, we know where they are, and if they become extinct in their native Philippines or Laos or Tibet or wherever, at least there might be some here. But you can't bring the seed in unless you can prove that the rhododendron was here before a certain date. I mean, these are the sorts of practicalities. By the way, that as a member, I get some of their rhodos. I got a beautiful rhododendron griffithianum. It's in the Red Book. It's terribly rare. And last summer, the cattle got in, and the only rhododendron they touched was Rhododendron griffithianum. However, I can report that it's recovering well and flowering at this moment. So, not knowing what's here creates very practical management issues, both for DOC, trying to preserve stuff, and MPI, trying to keep stuff out. Fundamental knowledge gaps surround soil health as well, including the factors that affect soil structure and functioning under different land uses. Those are particularly worrisome because soil is one of our natural assets. It's also a non-renewable resource. Now, one important gap relates to New Zealand's soil biodiversity. That's everything from basic information regarding the distribution and health of these communities to their various functions and contributions to soil quality. Further, the impacts of primary sector land use on soil microbes and invertebrates are unclear. Other knowledge gaps relate to the extent and impact of contaminants, including, say, pesticide residues or microplastics. Now, these knowledge gaps make it difficult to determine the impact of land use activities on the various dimensions of soil quality, including its chemical, biological, and physical properties. While these gaps pose an environmental risk, the consequences are also obviously economic. These impacts have the potential to undermine the productive capacity of New Zealand's soil resources and the production of agricultural, horticultural, and forestry products. These deficiencies in our knowledge base present a risk to New Zealand's primary sector industries that provide an important source of economic output and foreign exchange earnings. So it's not just an environmental issue, it's an economic issue. Which leads me to ask, why is environmental information important? Now, before I answer that, and I have a series of answers to that, let me acknowledge three things up front. Firstly, we will never have perfect information about our environment. There will always be more questions to be answered. So I can make fun of the biodiversity cube I put up, but it will always be that way to some extent. Secondly, having an environmental information doesn't automatically mean it will be used. People screen out what they don't want to hear. And thirdly, sometimes all the information we can gather tells us little more than the extent of what we don't know. And that can be radical. Some of the more novel and controversial fast-track projects are revealing this. Proposing seabed mining in a marine environment such as the Taranaki Bight runs up immediately against huge gaps in our understanding of what may be at stake out there. But if we don't have a comprehensive and detailed understanding of the ecosystems in the Taranaki Bight, how can we hope to understand the cumulative effects of mining? So, why is it worth persisting? I've reached a number of conclusions about why better environmental information is important. Firstly, what you don't know really can hurt you. Exhibit the well-publicised Havelock North drinking water affair, a tragic example of what can arise from a poor understanding of groundwater systems. The government's inquiry into the event found that, quote, the Regional Council's knowledge and awareness of aquifer and catchment contamination risks near Brookvale Road fell below required standards, unquote. In other words, poor knowledge of the groundwater system meant that poor decisions were made, resulting in illness and death. Secondly, not knowing things can prove to be expensive. By the way, I didn't give you the picture of Havelock North, so there's the picture of Havelock North. Not knowing things can prove to be expensive. Tairāwhiti contains some of the most erosion-prone land in the country. 60 to 100,000 hectares, or around 10 to 15% of the region, is classed as transition land, which is a nice euphemism. After Cyclone Bola in 1988, commercial planting was proposed to quickly clothe the highly erodible soils on the East Coast. It was controversial at the time, and there was some debate about the merit of planting a harvestable crop on such steep and erosion-prone land. Nevertheless, the East Coast Forestry Project was established in 1992 and offered tendered grants for planting pines, including, in some cases, allowing the removal of Manuka and Kānuka in order to plant the pines. A 1993 report entitled A Guide to the East Coast Forestry Project even stated that for both environmental, commercial and employment reasons, radiata pine is considered the first choice for planting. With the benefit of hindsight, we can now say that a better understanding of erosion susceptibility and sediment delivery to waterways would have eliminated some areas from commercial planting. Post-Cyclone Gabrielle, the Gisborne District Council has generated a map of the region which identifies areas having moderate to high susceptibility to landslides and high connectivity to waterways. So we've got that now, but this hindsight is expensive. The government spent $110 million clearing up silt and debris in Tairāwhiti after Gabrielle. And the business case for the sustainable land use transition, that's what that transition land means, in Tairāwhiti, indicates that the delivery phase for the first 10 years will cost $359 million. Now, while this slide is not Tairāwhiti, but rather Wairoa in the Hawke's Bay, it shows how granular the state-of-the-art information on susceptibility to landslides and connectivity to waterways, that's the map on the right, how granular that is compared with the erosion susceptibility classification map on the left. Now, the erosion susceptibility classification is used in our National Environmental Standard for Commercial Forestry. And it's been derived from the NZLRI database, the mapping of which was undertaken in the 1970s. Now, while the ESC zones show uniform susceptibility of land to erosion, higher resolution and more detailed mapping reveals much more heterogeneity and is obviously better suited for informing targeted management. Now, I'm currently finalising a publication on the land use classification system, its derivative, the erosion susceptibility classification, and their use in a regulatory context in New Zealand with the aim of releasing that before Christmas. I should note in passing that at the other end of the spectrum, knowing the same thing n times over without any methodological consistency is also very expensive. Let's call it wheel reinvention. The problem seems endemic with data gathering, data analysis and modelling. For example, over 70 local authorities have had to procure flood maps to provide information about flood risk, but the maps have been constructed using different models and methods. The quality of the maps varies, of course, depending as well on the quality of the underlying information. No current publicly available map combines high-quality, detailed local or regional flood information with national data to build a unified and consistent view. That is why MFE is currently developing New Zealand's first national flood map to provide a trusted source of flood risk information for the whole country. So that's a bright spot. The map will unify the best available local, regional and national scale data. I say the best available, it doesn't guarantee that it's all of equal quality. So everyone can access information to help them make informed decisions, and they're expecting to release that in 2027. Now, I described a particularly bad case of wheel reinvention in my review of water modelling. There are at least 75 biophysical freshwater models being used by regional councils and unitary authorities in a regulatory context to assist with water resource management. By the way, a lot of them are only being used once. So there are some which are, they get quite a bit of use, but it's a very long tail of single models, some of which have been commissioned by councils, found to be complex and expensive and put on the shelf. Many of the models have overlapping functions, meaning they're used in the same environmental domain, sometimes for the same purpose. For example, 19 water quality models are used to estimate nutrient loads in rivers and streams, and 13 models are used to assess sediment in rivers and streams. Now, this I'm not saying there should be one model to rule them all, but a proliferation of overlapping models isn't helpful because for one reason, regulators are then faced with the quandary of having to choose the best model and then defend that choice, often in resource management hearings, and that's not an easy task. I have called for a suite of preferred models to be chosen and a national freshwater modelling support centre to be established to coordinate technical modelling expertise. I'm not calling for a return of the Ministry of Works, but back then we did have the capacity at the centre to actually get some critical mass of expertise to provide guidance, and I think we need that. Thirdly, what we don't know can make a mockery of regulatory systems. Now, take, for example, chemicals in the environment. We know very little about them. I examined the problem in a report entitled Knowing What's Out There. We identified significant gaps in the monitoring of contaminants across New Zealand. For example, while groundwater is monitored for pesticides every 4 years, we lack nationwide monitoring for pesticides in other receiving environments. We found that organic compounds, including emerging contaminants, don't receive the same level of scrutiny as heavy metals in either national or regional monitoring. Now, in 2023, health officials in France alerted the public to the fact that a majority of drinking water samples tested by the government contained chlorothalonil. This highly toxic fungicide was banned in the EU in 2019 due to concerns over water contamination and elevated cancer risks associated with its metabolites. Chlorothalonil is approved for use by trained and certified commercial operators in New Zealand. However, no one tracks where or how much of it is released into the environment, which means we can't even begin to understand whether this sort of contamination might be a problem, even though another jurisdiction is concerned about it to the point of forbidding its use. Now, the sort of regional information we need could be gleaned by using chemical sales data as a proxy for use. Such data is collected in Australia, Canada, and the EU on pesticide use, but not here. If we had such information, we could organise our environmental monitoring efforts more efficiently to match regional patterns of use. There's been one recent positive step in that direction. Changes to the Hazardous Substances Importers and Manufacturers Notice 2015 mean that from next year, the EPA will be able to collect and report on the quantities of certain categories of chemicals either imported into or manufactured in New Zealand. So we'll have a national level view of chemical quantities. But guess what? They balked at the next fence. No, they weren't given the power to collect regional sales data. So we still have no idea in the country where these chemicals are being used. Needless to say, they are used in specific places and particular regions, depending on the chemical, not sprinkled evenly across the country. One of the EPA's roles is to set environmental exposure limits, EELs. Frankly, they don't use them as much as they should, in my view, but when they do, they should be able to know whether those limits are being reached. What's the point of having environmental exposure limits when you can't monitor to find out where stuff might be entering the environment and check that it's at the level your regulations suggested it should be? Fourth, what we don't know prevents us from understanding whether we're making a difference. New Zealand is a biological economy, and it's heavily reliant on primary industries and tourism for much of its export income. Yet, we have a poor handle on what is actually happening on the land. You would think that a land-based economy would have comprehensive, real-time information about how land is being used so that we can understand what the consequences of land use change may mean for the environment. Well, we don't. This includes a comprehensive land use data, frequent and well-distributed water monitoring, and detailed assessments of properties. Just let me check. For example, LiDAR, an invaluable remote sensing tool for creating digital elevation models of the Earth's surface and objects. Many environmental applications, including natural hazard management, but we don't have national coverage. It's extraordinary. In Manawatu, Whanganui and Otago, we don't have LiDAR. We're just about to do a lot of mining in Otago, I'm told. Without consistent and robust information about the land, how we use it, and what sorts of environmental impacts those uses may have, we can't assess whether any of our environmental policies are making a difference, or whether taxpayers' money has been spent effectively. To be able to do this, we need to be able to combine consistent and robust environmental information with up-to-date land use information. That would allow us, for example, to identify the different types of land uses that are located in flood-prone areas and then assess how they might be affected by climate change. It could help us understand the effect of spatial policies, such as farm plans, which are all the rage, on land management and whether they are effective in improving environmental outcomes. As noted in the work of our Land and Water Science Challenge, our current monitoring networks are insufficiently extensive to confidently detect change. Our knowledge about land use is even sparser. While councils have good records of consents in their regions, that's a tiny fraction of what goes on. Most uses are permitted activities. As a result, we don't even know how many farms are operating across New Zealand. Now, this lack of information poses significant challenges for, one, preparing practical and effective policies, and two, having a chance of implementing them. Current attempts to change planning and environmental statutes are revealing the vulnerabilities of our rather threadbare biophysical information. The Fast Track Approvals Act has put the problem into sharp relief. Its requirement for one-time or one-shot information provision puts both applicants and expert panels under real stress. Unlike standard consenting processes which allow for iterative requests, the fast-track process puts significant pressure on panels to identify and request any information they need upfront. You've got to know what you need upfront. This means the panels need to be exhaustive and identify every potential deficiency in the project application from the outset. Any missed information or new issue discovered later can't be addressed through a further information request. A recent and ill-considered amendment, on which I will be making my verbal presentation tomorrow in the Environment Select Committee, but a recent and ill-considered amendment that's been introduced to try to make fast track even faster risks blowing up the entire system. The government claims that its further tweaks will save an additional 6 weeks in the time needed to examine applications. 6 weeks, when the consents that flow from an approval may last 35 years. Faced with impossible demands for information that may or may not exist, panels have 3 choices available to them. Take a conservative stance and decline the application. Secondly, burden applications with onerous conditions to cover for the uncertainties, things you didn't know about. Or approve applications without knowing enough to impose sensible conditions and just hope nothing goes wrong. All I can say is that I would not like to be living downstream of a tailings dam approved under a fast-track inquiry that was given neither the time nor the information to make a genuinely well-informed judgment. That's one of our famous historic sites in New Zealand. Upcoming changes to the resource management system will rely heavily on information if they are to succeed. And I hope they do, because I think there are some good ideas in what's proposed for resource management reform. But to be able to set meaningful standards and environmental limits, we need to know both what's currently happening and what might happen using modelling and other forecasting tools. The new system that's being designed envisages reliance on the expanded use of national standards to reduce the need for resource consents. But this requires underpinning information about the current state of the environment so that appropriate performance standards can be set. The world of permitted uses and rigorous ex post compliance and enforcement that ministers are talking about requires high-quality monitoring information. Without it, the private sector will not be able to demonstrate compliance, unless, of course, we decide that compliance is all too hard. The use of novel tools, such as biodiversity credits and offsets, will make particular demands on high-quality information. The key point to make, and it's my worry, is that we don't have a great history of recovery when we've crossed environmental limits or bottom lines. We need to know where the limits or lines are before we cross them. It is generally cheaper not to screw things up in the first place. Now, I've been calling for urgent attention to the state of environmental information for 8 years now. It's not just about collecting more data, it's about being able to integrate it and interrogate it easily. We need to be able to quickly and easily draw together existing information from numerous disparate sources so it can be used to support robust decision-making. For example, new information from consenting and monitoring, it's been gathered every day, needs to be able to be incorporated, ideally in near real time, to enable adaptive management. A system that can easily pull together information in this way will also be one that can swiftly identify gaps that can be filled as budgets allow. Now, the government's social investment approach is well supported through something called the Integrated Data Infrastructure, IDI, led by Stats New Zealand. The IDI is used to ensure that the development of social, health and socioeconomic policies informed by a strong evidence base. It's created the ability to generate quantitative insights on the effectiveness of policy interventions, both in terms of policy design and policy monitoring and evaluation. It is a very useful and robust tool. A similar tool is needed for environmental information and environmental investment. I have made the case for a federated environmental data system, which in my view needs to be able to bring multiple data layers together at geospatial points. So the IDI aggregates data at the level of the person, shorn of identifiers. We need to be able to do the same thing in the environment, but the pole around which you integrate is, I think, geospatial. We need to be able to leverage technological advances, including data processing, sensor technology, and artificial intelligence, to bring together existing data currently held by disparate entities and then to fill the many gaps that exist. I'm also acutely aware that the risks we're running with environmental information are potentially going to be heightened by the current round of science reforms. Now, I've made it clear to the Minister leading the reforms that I regard New Zealand's publicly funded environmental research capacity as a critical part of the system of agencies and processes on which we rely to manage our environment. Section 16 of my Act, the Environment Act, says that I am, amongst other things, to maintain an oversight of the effectiveness and efficiency of the system of agencies and processes on which we rely to manage our environment. I consider the science system absolutely foundational to that. And the government's reforms involve new advisory mechanisms and new funding entities. Now, to the extent that the reforms can introduce some coherence to our national research priorities and reduce the absurd levels of contestability that have been allowed to overwhelm the system, I think they could yield some real improvements. So I have an open mind. But it all depends on relative priorities and the absolute level of resources invested. I am unaware of pools of lazy money being frittered away on environmental research. And yet the panel that was asked to think about priorities was told to be bold and go where no one else has trodden and find money that isn't adding value, research that isn't adding value for New Zealanders. If you know what's happened to environmental research, actually research in general, over a lengthy period, I don't think there's a lot of money being frittered away lazily. On the contrary, I'm aware that many environmental research endeavours have been kept afloat for years without any nominal increase in resources. Yet these activities lie upstream of foundational assets like databases and collections and key capability, including our capacity to respond to emergencies like biosecurity breaches or natural hazard responses. We've got the Asian yellow hornet loose in Auckland now. You've got to be able to pull your skills rapidly together to understand a problem like that, and if you put them down the road, it'll be tricky. If these capabilities are placed at risk, and in some areas they may be no more than 1 or 2 researchers deep, then this entire land-based economy will be placed at risk. I am monitoring in real time, as best I can, how research dollars are being moved around in the course of these reforms. They appear to be zero-sum reforms. No investments, new investments in research are being made. So, any shiny new initiatives in AI or quantum this or quantum that will need to raid resources from other fields. If the environment loses research capability, we all need to understand what that will mean for the future state of the environment. Environmental information and the research base needed to support it should be regarded as core national assets. This is infrastructure that enables better decisions, and we need to invest in it every bit as much as we need to invest in hard infrastructure. I don't think that message has yet been heard. In conclusion, let me just say that I am well aware that resources are scarce, and that from a research point of view, there will never be enough money, just like there'll never be enough information to satisfy every doubt. And I understand in a way that most don't, I think, that governments have to make difficult trade-offs. But they also need to be able, having made them, to justify them. In my view, before we embark on any grand new schemes, we need to be sure that we have the capacity to deliver them and evaluate them. Information about the biophysical state of our environment is foundational to almost all our economic and social aspirations. It is not a nice to have. And neither is it something you can rustle up in a hurry on an as-needed basis. It is defensive, it is slow, and it is long. I leave it to you to decide whether we have the bureaucratic and political institutions that can grapple with that. But thanks for inviting me along.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Simon. Outstanding presentation, great insights into our environment and some of the key issues that we face. An opportunity now for questions and comments from the audience, please. Yeah, please. Well, there is a roving mic. We'll bring it around the room.
Thank you, Simon, for this. My Environment Canterbury colleagues are scared I'm going to say something I shouldn't.
Oh, right.
I won't. You've magnificent speech. You canvassed the things we don't know, really identified the lack of knowledge and the things that fall out of that lack of knowledge, and ultimately, to the end of the day, the need for data. And as a regulator in Canterbury, we cannot get enough money to take on wilding conifers or wallabies. How do we prioritise, given all the issues you raise? What are those real priorities to take us forward? Because we can gather data, we can talk, but then we need to give effect to what are the most critical things in your mind?
Well, I mean, you're getting onto the perennial issue of funding, and as I said at the end, there's never enough. You've got to make trade-offs. You've got to make decisions. You've got to decide what's most important. I mean, just the other week, I was up in the top of the arbor looking at the wilding problem, and the people there are saying, well, look, you spent however many million it was on Molesworth. If you don't get the branch lethem, it's all going to come back, and it's just going to go on spreading south, and goodbye North Canterbury, sort of thing. Now, it is possible to make a business case for what's at risk there. We have to, you and regional councils, I think that is the sort of analysis that you need to do. If that problem is beyond the region, then you have to turn to central government. I think what's happened is that over a lengthy period, and the RMA is partly to blame for this, we have, probably because we haven't managed information well, I think a lot of people at the political level have lost confidence in the system. They see paralysis by analysis. And, you know, can't we just get on and do stuff? And I think that's a wake-up call for all of us who are working in the environment. We need to make a much better evidence-based case. We need to use economic tools as well to make that case. When I arrived as Parliamentary Commissioner of the Environment, I didn't have a single economist on my staff. I've now got at least 3 people who are qualified in economics. I don't say anything without saying, hey, there's a fiscal risk here. Yes, there's an environmental reason for doing this, but it's also going to be very expensive if you don't. I gave you some of the numbers tonight. I think that is the hard-headed way to approach this. And I think you've got to talk to ratepayers, if I may, in the same way, to say, look, you know what the problems are. If you want something done about it, don't pretend it won't cost something. You know, people throw off at regional councils all the time. And I keep reminding them that in many cases they're doing what central government told them to do but didn't provide any money to go with it. I think, you know, we need to be honest about these things. So I'm not answering your question other than sympathising, but I think you really need to be very clear-minded. You need to get your facts together, and ministers of whatever colour need to hear that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Simon, you wouldn't expect me to sit here and not have a question.
No.
Here we are in the environment of the land-based university in the country, in the middle also of an area that is contributing significantly to the New Zealand economy through land-based industries. Now, tell us, give us advice to the Vice-Chancellor. What would you like to see this university doing to improve what you have outlined for us?
You can always count on Margaret to ask an impossible question. I didn't come with a homily about what you should be doing. To be honest with you, I actually probably have a relatively sketchy view of what you do. The amount of time I get to spend on any campus is quite limited. So I'll be frank with you, I can't tell you what you should be doing, other than to say that I would like universities collectively to get behind what I'm talking about in terms of having integrated environmental data. And if you haven't read the report, which I just popped up there, there it is. Oh, hang on. There. If you haven't read that, it's April this year, can I suggest you do? I've really taken this as far as I can. My team, we're not experts in IT and management of information. We took a lot of advice, talked to a lot of people, but the key point is there is huge amounts of information. It's not being collected in a coherent way. It's being held by different entities, no problem with that, but being held under different protocols in different ways. Some is accessible, some isn't. So there is a lot of real reinvention going on, even where information may exist. Now, look, we need some adult leadership. I think central government should nominate, this is my recommendation to them, you should nominate a minister, an agency to take the lead. It could be LINS, it could be Stats, it could be MFE, I don't care who. But sit down, talk to the private sector, who have a huge amount of knowledge in the space, and come up with a system whereby progressively we can pull down some of the barriers and integrate geospatially what we've got. I was in a an area council the other day, and it was fascinating. A whole team of people working on state of the environment reporting and doing a good job, from what I understand. Absolute Chinese wall, no connection at all with the people who are on the consenting side, and they're collecting gobs of data through the consenting system. Oh, they said, but that's all PDF based, in a possible way that would be suitable for our purposes. But surely we should be able to integrate this. It's all information. All information is valuable, but you need to be able to get it. And look, honestly, there are people in New Zealand today, farmers and others, who are spending money buying information that taxpayers have funded. There's a funding issue here, there's an access issue here. It's not straightforward, but Margaret, I think the Vice-Chancellor should read the report. I've got to an answer. He should read the report, talk to his colleagues, and tell the government that they agree with Simon Upton on this point.
Simon, I wanted to turn to a subject that's close to your heart, the issue of space invaders and environmental weeds. As someone working in that space, I've always found it challenging to get the data from different providers, ECAN, for example, or DOC, or MPI, or the City Council. And the reasoning they have is that, we can't do that because of privacy concerns. Yes. And they don't share it amongst themselves for the very same reason. So is that a real challenge? Is that a real problem? Or is it something that is just an excuse for not
No, I think it is real. For all sorts of different reasons. They've collected it on a particular basis, and then someone is saying, we'd like it for a different purpose, and they haven't collected it for that, and they don't have permission. This is why. But you see, this is what's been overcome with the IDIs, I understand it. That there's a huge amount of data being collected through the health system, the social security system, the education system, and it's highly private in the sense that it all relates to individual Kiwis. But we've developed the protocols to be able to depersonalise that and use it in the aggregate. We've got to do the same thing here, because it just doesn't make sense when Transbar goes through, they put a new line in, and they do all the geotech stuff here about a pylon, and then a few years later somebody does something close by. That information can't be used. You do it all again. By the way, the Infrastructure Commission agrees with me as well. This is a major cost and barrier to infrastructure development. So this is not just an environmental issue, it is an economic and developmental issue. We talked about living in the information age for the last few decades, but you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't know it in terms of our investment in it and the priority we give to access.
Simon, I'm really interested in the comments you made about adaptive management.
About?
Adaptive management. And it seems to me that information can be used to formulate policy, but it can also be used to review policy and adjust policy.
Yes.
And it's not just the information. There's something seems to be missing in the approach. We have a problem, so let's do something. There's a nitrate problem, so let's put farm plans in place. What do we do in terms of monitoring to say how effective this has been in terms of all the investment that's gone on private sector and government? And so it's something about policies in terms of requiring those reviews and that adaptive management approach, isn't it? Just as much as the information itself.
Yes, adaptive management on the one hand, and before you do the adapting, evaluating what has happened. I've done a lot of thinking about this. I didn't put a slide up to here tonight, but you may be aware I've produced something called an estimate of environmental expenditure, which tries to track all Crown spending against 5 major environmental outcomes. So we don't look at government departments or whatever, we look at where the money goes and how it contributes. I'm trying to get Parliament to think about what's the outcome you're after. So rather than boring into MPI or MFE as to what you spent this on or that on, what we want to know is how many government programs contribute to a particular outcome. Let's look at whether we are actually achieving that outcome. Let's have some evaluation of policy and be prepared to change course. Part of this is being a bit adult, I think, about politics. Politics is so often about, got to be seen to do something, got to have a policy. And from an opposition point of view, it's about let's show that the policy isn't working and or they're not spending enough. I mean, I think it should be a mark of democratic maturity to say we start into something like water policy and we're evaluating as we go, and if it's not generating results, it is a mark of success that we say stop. It's just not worth the expenditure. We need a different approach. That's why, if you've seen my report Going with the Grain, I ended up in a completely different position from where I started. And I honestly think that water quality in agriculture needs to be driven from the bottom up, not the top down. I really believe that catchment groups are potentially the big source for change, but they've got to have good quality information. If they're going to make some trade-offs, if they're going to look at the information, it won't be farm by farm, it'll be sub-catchment by sub-catchment. They need good information. How can you do that if you haven't got access to information? So I'm afraid all of these roads come back to that. But I completely agree with you that whatever we do in the environmental space, we need to be evaluating. Because look, the problems are so big and the amount of money, even on the most optimistic budget, is so small that we can't afford to do everything. So we have to prioritise and we have to know if we're making a difference. We do not know, in most cases, whether we are making a difference, unfortunately. And look, if I could just end up with another number. It won't be a number, but it involves big numbers. On that Wilding Pines business, 100 million spent over 4 years. 100 million. Why did we spend 100 million on Wilding Pines? Because, and good on MPI, when the government said, COVID, help, economic crisis, what's shovel ready? MPI said, we've got a deal for you. We've got something called Wildings. And they were in a position to move. Good on them. We've spent 100 million. But we know that the residual expenditure each year is way short of what's needed even to maintain the progress that's been made. So we'll have thrown taxpayers' dollars at wilding control, which we know will be wasted. Why did you spend it in the first place if you couldn't maintain the investment? It's that sort of stuff that really we have to focus on.
Simon, thank you once again for an absolutely wonderful presentation and great insights. You've given me some reading as a Vice-Chancellor.
Yes.
You've also given me some strong discussion points with not only other Vice-Chancellors, but CEOs and emerging public research organisations of what is very important about environmental management and the need for environmental information in a more federated system than what we have. Thank you once again for a very insightful presentation. Good luck at the Select Committee tomorrow, and trust you well for your trip back to Wellington.
It's on about 1 o'clock if you want to watch.
Okay, thank you. Please join us in the foyer now for some reception and food out there. Thank you.